Hi, I'm David Barr Kirtley, author of the book Save Me, Please, and Other Stories, and welcome to episode 576 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show, we'll be discussing Robert Heinlein's classic novel Stranger in a Strange Land, about a human being raised by Martians. And this will include spoilers for everything in the book, so just be aware of that. And I'm joined by three guests. So first up, we've got Lisa Yaszek, making her 12th appearance on the show. She's Regents Professor of Science Fiction Studies at Georgia Tech, and author of the nonfiction books Galactic Suburbia, Sisters of Tomorrow, and The Future is Female. Her new book, The Future is Female Volume 2, The 1970s, is out now. So Lisa, welcome to the show.
Hi, Dave. It's great to be back.
The next up, we've got John Kessel, making his 9th appearance on the show. He's the author of novels such as The Moon and the Other and Pride and Prometheus, and short story collections such as The Pure Product and The Bomb Plan for Financial Independence. His collection, The Dark Ride, the best short fiction of John Kessel, is out now. So, John, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
And also joining us today is Robby Soave, who you may remember from our feature interview back in episode 488, and from our panel on The Moon is a Harsh Mistress back in episode 516. He's a senior editor at Reason, and author of the books Panic Attack, Young Radicals in the Age of Trump, and Tech Panic, Why We Shouldn't Fear Facebook and the Future. Forbes named him to their 30 under 30 list in the category of law and policy, and The Spectator calls him a sought-after player in the Beltway's Dungeons & Dragons circles. So, Robby, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
Okay, so let's start off with John, and have you tell us about the first time you read Stranger in a Strange Land.
Gosh, I guess I'm the senior partner here today anyway. I read it when it came out. It came out, I guess, in 61. So it would have been 61 or 62. And I checked it out of the public library. And I was a big Heinlein fan already. I'd read his many of his juvenile novels written in the 50s, but also his classic stuff written in the 40s, which is all collected in different anthologies. That I was just a tremendous science fiction freak as a kid. And so I read it, and I was just about going through puberty, and it really overwhelmed me. This book, I was already a Heinlein fan, and I was really overpowered by Heinlein's convictions and his arguments, and also the story, at least at first, really was really engrossing. And of course, the fact that it had at least alluded to sex frequently, that was something that was interesting to me. So I was really on board for that at the time. And years later, I cooled considerably on it. But when I was that young guy there, I really was into it. And of course, I was part of the boomer generation. And so later in the 60s, when I among millions of others became basically a hippie. When I was in college, it became an extremely popular book and was read by everybody. People who didn't read science fiction read that book, and the whole free love thing, it really sort of melded in with that. When we could talk about that, maybe I won't say any more about that right now.
Yeah, but I mean, that's interesting to me I was wondering if it was a thing like with James Joyce's Ulysses, where there was this famous obscenity trial, and then a lot of people who wouldn't ordinarily have read the book read it because they thought it was going to be titillating or something. I mean, it was a similar thing with Stranger in a Strange Land, where people were picking it up because they were expecting it to be sexual or titillating?
It was mostly young people who were doing this. I don't think a lot of older folks, I would think of older folks who are the ones who sought out Ulysses or Lady Chatterley's Lover, which both were made okay at that time. But, Stranger was more, it was a pop novel that along with the other, if you're reading Kurt Vonnegut, reading Heinlein's book would slot in with that. It wasn't really considered a literary book in any way, I think.
So would you say that the reception among the science fiction community at the time was like generally positive, or was there a divided opinion at that time?
No, it was pretty much positive. It won a Hugo Award for Best Novel of the Year. I think it was like this. he won 4 Hugo Awards for Best Novel, which no one's ever done. I don't think, maybe by now it's someone else has done that. But so it was really, I mean, Heinlein at that point, he and Arthur Clarke and Isaac Asimov were considered the very best science fiction writers in the universe, maybe Ray Bradbury. So you know, he already had a huge following in science fiction, and these books, this one and Starship Troopers and some of the other ones, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, were very popular. So now, and I think with the counterculture, that was interesting. I mean, I think that a lot of people who didn't read other Heinlein works, you know, who were like hippies like me, 20-year-olds, reading this book, didn't really have a context from which to read it. So I think a lot of them assumed that Heinlein must be some kind of like, you know, Richard Brautigan, San Francisco guy, you know, smoking a joint and who really, but of course that's far, far from the truth. And I think he was sort of dismayed by the numbers of hippies who you know, saw him as a guru of some sort. I don't think he wanted to have anything to do with them as far as I know.
Yeah. Well, so how about Lisa? Kind of what's your history with Stranger in a Strange Land?
Yeah. So the first time I read it was in college. And so, you know, okay, boomer, as Gen X, I get to speak as Gen X now, right? Yeah. So I was like, I read it the first time as a sort of post-punk, post-feminist, post-modernist graduate student, scholar, science fiction fan. You know, I was at that point just kind of reading some of the older stuff just to get some canon behind me. And it didn't make a ton of an impression on me. Like, I knew its cultural significance, but I was also, again, kind of underwhelmed, you know, as a sort of 1990s riot girl. It just wasn't really my jam. And I'm like, okay, cool. I've read it. I get it. I sort of ran back into Stranger in a Strange Land again when I started participating in WisCon, the largest and oldest feminist science fiction convention in the late 1990s. And there was a lot of debate about Heinlein at that point within the feminist science fiction community about whether reading him and liking him was a travesty and sort of a sin against all womankind, or whether we should give him an A for effort, essentially, and say, you know, at least in Heinlein, you got to ride shotgun and carry your own gun, better than being stuck back in the kitchen during the apocalypse. So, you know, that was a kind of fun debate. And then this is actually the third time. This is I haven't really looked at Stranger again since then. As a college professor, I actually teach a lot of Heinlein's short stories frequently, and I enjoy them. It was interesting coming back to the novel now. I found that some of the sort of linguistic tricks I enjoy in the short stories didn't gel as well for me at the novel length, but that's cool. But I really this time enjoyed the novel as a period piece this time. I mean, it really just seemed to me like the embodiment of the Playboy philosophy and the whole 1960s sexual revolution in all the really great and all the really awful ways, but just kind of fascinating to look back at that time.
Yeah, well, maybe you had talked about this over email, but do you want to just maybe explain quickly what you mean by the Playboy philosophy if anyone listening doesn't know what that is?
Right. So a lot of people will know, right, that Hugh Hefner started Playboy magazine in the 1950s, and through the 50s and 60s, it was really seen as the vanguard of the sexual revolution, and also as a place where you could publish some edgy fiction. And there was actually a lot of overlap between the Playboy empire and the science fiction community. And Heinlein was in and out of that throughout that decade. But the Playboy philosophy was something that Hefner always wrote editorials. He was kind of like Hugo Gernsback, actually, and John Campbell in that way. He was, no, seriously, constantly editorializing about the importance of his magazine and these cultural changes it was participating in. And from, I think, 1963 to 64, he put it all together in something he called the Playboy philosophy. And this was Hefner's sort of mashup of capitalism and the sexual revolution and who knows what else went into that. And it was his whole philosophy about how modern society has destroyed the uncommon man and replaced him with the common man. And the uncommon man has to come back and liberate himself from like the economic and religious and philosophical shackles of modern Christianity and modern capitalism. And if all goes well, the modern liberated woman will also, throw off her shackles of oppression and accompany him, I guess, into the future. And it was this sort of really rambling, disjointed thing that went on, but it got a lot of play to the point where sometime in the late 1960s, one of the big New York radio stations actually did a roundtable between Hugh Hefner and all of these heads of different religious organizations about the impact of the Playboy philosophy on religious ideas about sex and gender. It was wild stuff.
And you were saying that Hefner was actually into science fiction, and so it's plausible that either he influenced Heinlein or Heinlein influenced him.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So Hefner had been part of the Weird Tales Club back in the 1940s when he was a young lad. And from the beginning, Playboy courted science fiction authors to write for them. They had Richard Matheson, Arthur C. Clarke, and Heinlein himself had been asked to write a short story specifically for Playboy. That was All You Zombies, which when Playboy got it, they completely freaked out. Like, oh, nope, we can't publish that. That's too sexy. Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction happily grabbed it and published it. But then Hefner participated in some Playboy roundtables with other science fiction authors in the 60s. And there's a really famous Heinlein interview in Playboy, I think from 68 or 69. So there was this long and tangled, connection between, I guess, Hefner and Heinlein, and whether or not they knew each other personally and were like sitting down, having scotches and talking about this. It's interesting that there either seems to be one of them influencing the other, or, more likely maybe an X factor in the air that was influencing both of their thinking about sex and society.
I mean, so this is my first time reading Stranger in a Strange Land, and I grew up reading a lot of Heinlein because my parents were both big Heinlein fans. So, stuff like Tunnel in the Sky and Time for the Stars, Orphans of the Sky were books I really loved growing up. But I was always warned not to read late Heinlein, by my parents. They said he got kind of weird and like weird sex and lots of sort of political diatribes and things like that. So I never read, this. I never read Moon is a Harsh Mistress. We did that last time, but so at least my parents were at least among science fiction fans at the time. I remember my mom saying very explicitly that she was sort of affronted when everyone was reading Stranger in a Strange Land because she felt like this was the worst Heinlein book she'd ever read, and people were all just raving about how great it was. So at least there was some contingent that that didn't like the direction he was going in as an author. But
I've always heard. Oh, sorry. I was going to say, I've always heard people say you're either a Heinlein fan or a Stranger in a Strange Land fan, but never both.
But I want to bring Robby in here too. So Robby, I think you said last time that you had tried to read this and kind of gave up on it at one point. Is that right?
No, I think tried to read it meant I had read like the back cover in some library at some point. So no, I was not at all overly familiar with this. I knew that the story was a, kind of fish out of water tale of, I actually thought it was a actual Martian come to Earth rather than someone who was human, but had just been raised on Mars, like a raised by wolves situation. So it certainly did surprise me in the second half of the book. I would say the first half of the book was pretty much exactly what I expected. I was a little bit, surprised and hooked, I would say, by his Mike's, magic powers when he first uses them to save him and Jillian from the police that are after them is a really cool moment. I, like your mother, was not overly enthralled with the second half of the book for, I guess, a variety of reasons we'll probably get into. But I see now very clearly how it would fit into a 60s free love hippie ethos. Heinlein does an incredible job. If he didn't intend to be a kind of guru to that movement, he certainly understood it well enough to portray himself as such. It is interesting to compare it to The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, which we discussed last time, which I think more closely models at least my own personal politics. And I hope that's not entirely the reason why I prefer Moon is a Harsh Mistress to this book, is that like I agree with it or something. That would be pretty overly simple. But there's just so much philosophy in the second book, the second part of Stranger. It was interesting to read it. I was staying in Vegas for a part of the time that I was reading Stranger Strangeland, and I also have been watching for the first time this television show on HBO, Hacks, which takes place in Vegas, and so it's interesting to be in that setting or watching something else that takes place there for the part where where they decide, Mike and Jillian decide the best use of their time is to like work at a casino and have her be a showgirl, and it just feels totally out of left field, but then so does everything that happens after that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I knew just from cultural osmosis, I knew that it was about a guy named Valentine Michael Smith who was raised by Martians and comes to Earth with this sort of like you're saying, yeah, this sort of like innocent, attitude toward Earth customs. And I knew he had lots of sex and founded his own religion. And I think that's pretty much everything I knew about the book. I was always kind of fascinated by the book, even though I'd been warned off it growing up. I always thought the title was cool. I always thought the cover was cool. It shows Mike kind of like meditating at the bottom of a swimming pool with this beautiful woman kind of coming down from above and caressing his face. And I was always really intrigued by the fact that this book showed up in the Billy Joel song, We Didn't Start the Fire. Just the idea that a science fiction novel could have such an impact that it would be mentioned on a list of the most important events of the 20th century always made me kind of interested. I guess the other reason I wanted to talk about it now is because of just the continuing cultural influence of the word grok. Even going to the fact that Elon Musk just named his new chatbot Grok. I was kind of like, as a science fiction podcast host, I ought to maybe read this book and just see what this is all about, just so I know what it's exactly what the story is. But I had pretty low expectations going in. I mean, I reached out to a bunch of people, and pretty much everyone I talked to said, who'd read the book said, I'd be happy to talk about it, but just to warn you, I detest the book and everything it stands for. So I would say I had pretty low expectations going in. But so Robby, I guess talk just a little bit more about, so you went into this pretty fresh, it sounds like, kind of just, yes. What were your initial impressions of the book, just reading the first couple chapters?
Well, the first part I found, fascinating. It was it's action heavier. It's they're in a complicated political situation where Valentine Michael Smith is, for technical reasons, the inheritor of of Mars in a property and political and legal sense, and people are after him, and he has kind of friends who are helping. It's more like an action movie type thing. Not that I'm relentlessly just pursuing action. I obviously knew it was going to be heavy and it was going to be philosophical and it was going to have ideas. But there was something exciting about that, and I kind of assumed it was going to be one of those things where, okay, they spend the first part at the hospital, then he's on the run, then he's with Jubal Harshaw as they're working out things. Then I kind of thought there was going to be another next threat in terms of some other one of these, they kind of hint at the global organizations, the UN kind of organizations that's running things. One point they suggest that maybe the Martians are coming, he's some plot of, and eventually reveals that he does believe himself to be part of some complicated Martian plot to conquer or attack Earth, that they were going to bring in that perspective. The church was going to be a rivalry, but a character, but then no, it just, for the second half, the action really cools down to, let's start a cult, and we're all going to get naked and we're going to all have sex. And it goes from being it's a very, this very horny book. I think they would say that the kids would say a very thirsty book, which maybe makes sense for all the emphasis on water and sharing water. But all the, it's not like, it's not like I'm a prude or something. I've read sexual content. There's a way it's presented in here that feels wrong in some way that I can't quite put my finger on. Maybe my co-panelists can.
Well, people, if you haven't read the book and you're listening to this, you're probably getting the sense that there's a lot of kind of random stuff that happens in this book. I want to sort of focus on kind of the first third. So this is basically up until the part where the Jubal Harshaw character shows up. You have this, it's more of a science fiction novel. There's more stuff about the Martians. So I'm curious, John, since you're a big science fiction guy, what did you think about this this basic setup of the Martians have raised this Earth child, and now he's come to Earth with his Martian perspective.
Yeah, I was very caught up in it, and Heinlein in this first really for third to the half of the book, it seems to me he's writing the kind of science fiction he was really well known for, where you have a fundamental, speculation. Here we got this human being raised by Martians, never seen a human being since his infancy. And he comes to Earth, and then he's going to interact with all of us and our culture and our habits. He's never seen a female, so he discovers sex for the first time. So that's a setup that can be used for a lot of social commentary. And Heinlein did a lot of social commentary in his earlier fiction. Actually, I've heard that he wrote the first third of this book in the late 40s or early 50s, and then he stopped. And then he came back to it 6, 8, 10 years later and wrote the rest of the book, which might explain why it takes such a drastic turn after they finally settled the legal issues of who owns Mars and, Mike's safety from the government and other actors is essentially assured by Jubal's machinations. But anyway, all those machinations and the whole process of him first encountering people. I noticed one thing about the book as a writer is that it's very fluid in its point of view. Heinlein does not hesitate to switch point of view in the middle of chapters to give you everyone's different perspective on the situations. Although he often will settle into Jubal's point of view in the second half, I think quite tiresomely, but at any rate. So that whole science fiction thing appealed to me, a lot. And there's some very amusing things where Mike doesn't know. He's not familiar with things that we take for granted. So, for instance, one of the characters, Ben Caxton, who's a journalist, has an apartment, and in this near future, he has instead of a rug, he has a lawn, a green of grass in his living room. And Mike is afraid to walk on it because he's afraid the grass will not like it. The grass, he thinks of it as a being that he ought to respect its autonomy. And he has to be persuaded that, no, grass is okay with being walked on. It doesn't mind it. And so that kind of very alien perspective, I think, can be very amusing. It's one of the things science fiction can do that is I think, it's really, really cool. Causes you to see things differently. And there's a number of that sort of thing in the first third of the book. And then there's less and less of it, I think, as the book goes on.
Yeah. And so the Martians, that was definitely, just as a science fiction fan, that was my favorite part of the book. Like Mike and his Martian perspective. Whenever there was some sort of hint about what the Martian society is like, that's when I kind of perked up. And the Martians are very alien. They're weird. They sort of start out as little balls of hair or something, and then they grow into some sort of large things. The description is a little vague, but they pass through these different stages, and they eventually turn into kind of ghosts. And then the ghosts are kind of, we gather, sort of omniscient and telepathic, and sort of run the whole society. And the living Martians are kind of just workers serving the interests of the ghosts. They're called the Old Ones. And so they don't have any sort of property. They don't have money. They don't have, they can be killed by intense emotions. There's all this kind of really kind of out there stuff about this alien life form. So Lisa, what did you think of the Martians in this book?
I'm with all of you. That the first third is definitely my favorite part of it. And I think it's the part that really stands up well to the test of time. Because like John was saying, that is one of the really cool things science fiction can do, right? It can give you these alien perspectives in these ways that feel pretty effortless. And like you, I was excited every time we got to learn more about the Martians. And at first, I also was like, wow, they're so different than the humans. But then the more I thought about it, I thought Robert Heinlein is pretty clever because the Martians aren't any different than us. They're exactly like us. Like, how is it that we as humans aren't mindlessly serving all the old ones before us, right? And all of their ideas and whims. I mean, that's just ideology sort of extrapolated and made biological with aliens.
There were parts of the first third that I found laugh out loud funny when he's trying to when Mike is trying to understand how he's offended various people in his way and is about to almost do his equivalent of like committing suicide, of turning into a nothing because he's so offended people. It's laugh out loud funny stuff the way it's written. It's really clever. Mike's whole way of thinking and processing, just beyond the word grok, but the waiting till waiting is full terminology, and it was a goodness. I listened to part of the book on audio tapes, and the voice actor they had for him was so talented. Just this very emotionless, calm, fitting the almost like calm pool of water motif in the I was waiting, Jillian, till it's full, that kind of thing. It was a really creative language that he created for this character.
Yeah, well, I mean, so obviously I'm a big fan of comedic science fiction, like just given the name of this podcast, I like Douglas Adams, like that kind of thing. And so I agree with you, Robby. I mean, I had no idea going into this that this was like a comedic novel in a way. And so I actually, and like I said, I had pretty low expectations. And so as it sort of unfolded more and more with the humor, I was like, oh, I'm gonna like this. I'm gonna be into this. It was reminding me of I was writing down like Sirens of Titan, Spaceballs, Idiocracy. Those were some of the things that this was making me think of. And so yeah. So I mean, my initial impressions were like the way that the male characters talk to the female characters is extremely patronizing and condescending. And so that was a big turnoff for me. And if I was just reading this for fun, I probably would have just stopped reading because of that. But since it was of historical value and I was reading it for the podcast and everything, I'm like, okay, I'm going to set that aside and keep going. And I was actually enjoying the book a lot more than I was expecting because I found it funny. And like when Mike says, he says like, I don't know, I'm only an egg and stuff. It was stuff like that I thought was, yeah, like you say, legitimately laugh out loud funny. Go ahead.
I was going to say that I don't think Heinlein is a comic writer, however, and I think he might have had a hard time maintaining that through a whole book. I read a lot of Heinlein, and he just doesn't have that great a sense of humor. So this stuff that's funny there is sort of, I mean, it's like he's channeling, Voltaire and Candide for the first third of the book. Okay. And then he sort of can't keep it up anymore. And then it turns into lectures about how we ought to behave. And so that's the thing. I think he can't maintain that satirical edge. And in the book turns more into a propounding Heinlein's ideas. And I guess some people have argued, well, you can't assume that everything that Jubal Harshaw says is really Heinlein's idea, but I find very little space between what Harshaw says and we haven't even talked about Jubal, because in some ways, Mike, even though he's the central character of the book, is not the main character of the book. I mean, Jubal is on the page much more than Mike is. It's Jubal's opinions that get expressed. It's Jubal's reactions that are interesting. It just seems to me that, or maybe they're not, his reactions aren't necessarily interesting, but a whole lot of the book is dialogue between Jubal and other characters about proper behavior, which has always actually struck me as a kind of interesting thing about Heinlein, is that he's a libertarian, but he's very concerned with proper behavior. And a lot of the narrative here is people arguing about how you're supposed to do things. So the rules of the culture and any organization, So for instance, the Water Brotherhood that Mike introduces, which is this a Martian thing about if you share water with someone else, then you become kind of a blood brother to that person, and it's a huge bond. It entails a lot of obligation and acceptance of the other person, and a lot of what goes on with Mike and other people is sort of figuring out the parameters of what Water Brotherhood means. I'm sorry if I've gotten off the traffic a little bit.
So since you brought up the Jubal Harshaw character, who's like the other major character in the book. Let's talk about him. So Lisa, why don't you just tell us about Jubal Harshaw? Kind of what is he like?
Yeah, well, I think that John is right, that at some level, this book is about Harshaw more than it is about, right, Mike. Because the drama, especially at the end, right, is that even when Jubal is sort of proven correct about all of his philosophizing, he can't make the leap himself, right, to join this new society. And the drama at the end is him, right, like deciding, oh, I'm not an old man. I'm not that old. I can join this new society and change. And I think that that's linked to what John was talking about, like the drama of Jubal, who's always right and always the center of everything, having to figure out how he's going to be meaningfully connected to these other people, to his water brothers, right?
Well, but he's sort of this wish fulfillment, it seems to me anyway, this sort of wish fulfillment version of Heinlein. He's like, we're told that he's under different pseudonyms, he's like 6 out of the 8 most popular authors on Earth. And he has this coterie of attractive secretaries who he dictates his writing to, who like hang on his every word. And everyone just basically tells him how awesome he is all the time.
You can imagine how a 12-year-old boy reacted to that.
So I've heard, my husband tells me he read this in his, I think, like teens or something. And also John found it to be a revelation that no longer feels so revelatory to him. But I agree. I mean, Jubal's hard. That's the part where I think we were emailing about this, and I'm just like, I'm done with this book and I'm out. And I think that's when we turn into the second third, and all of a sudden Jubal is pronouncing on everything. And on the one hand, Heinlein does a little bit continue the technique of Jubal pronounces and then we'll shift to someone else's perspective and it'll undercut Jubal a little bit. And you're like, oh, thank goodness. But it never lasts, right? Like somehow, even when Jubal admits he's wrong, he somehow ends up being right and at the center of everything. And it's just tiring. And of course, it's a wish fulfillment. Who doesn't want to be right and at the center of everything and have all the hot men and hot women want you? But, I mean, tiring to read. That's all I can say. So, yeah.
So
he is, though. I just want to say, he literally, though, is the dramatization. And I kept putting this in my notes of what Hugh Hefner called the uncommon man. I mean, he really is, right? Like he's this sort of ideal capitalist who's also an artist, who's also heroic, sort of mixes the merits of free enterprise capitalism and individualism and free expression. And it's just too much. It's a lot.
Yes.
And tie it in with the sort of sexual attitudes and I'm out.
Yeah. So like I said, I was enjoying the first third or so more than I was expecting. And then there's this part that John mentioned where Jubal is basically acting as Mike's like lawyer to negotiate to get the government off his back, basically. And in the version I read, I guess I should explain, there was like the shorter version and the longer version. And because Heinlein originally wrote this at like 220,000 words or something, and his publisher made him cut 60,000 words out of it, which is the published version that existed for decades until in the 90s, after Heinlein's death. His wife, organized the publication of the uncut version that he had written in the first place. But so anyway, so in the version I read, this section where Jubal is negotiating on behalf of Mike, I swear it goes on for like 100 pages. It went on so long. And that is the point where I definitely lost all momentum on the story.
I would say I enjoyed parts of that. Jubal's skilled, manipulations of like the people who are, here's how you're going to sit at the table, and him, kind of always one-upping maybe because it's just he's one-upping government bureaucrats, which I find amusing. That's all. I was all prepared to be on board with that. It's then just like his continued prominent position in the novel, and not really having any. I think it would have been interesting if he would eventually come into conflict or something with Mike, but really doesn't, and is just the only. He has that kind of conflict with himself about whether he's too old to be part of the sex cult, and then decides he's not, and which is not a high stakes conflict for the reader, and is very much a wish fulfillment Heinlein himself. What's most interesting on that front is late in the book, where it looks like Ben Caxton, one of the only other characters of any significance, kind of recoils in horror at what's going on and comes to Jubal for advice and is told, try it again, and then is absolutely converted to it, which is like they took an interesting moment and then subverted it into something that was, okay, I guess he's on board.
Yeah, well, I think that's chapter 33, if I remember correctly, which is essentially a chapter-long lecture on why polyamory is good.
Yeah,
which I'm totally sympathetic with, but I didn't need an entire chapter just propounding those ideas.
And that particular argument was it was a terrible argument. It's rooted in this weird Darwinian kind of logic that doesn't really make sense.
Well, do you know there's that meme that everyone makes fun of for a couple approaching a third at a bar or something, where it's, hey, we dig your vibe or something, and like everyone makes fun of it. That was this whole book. Was that like it just made you uncomfortable? Like, not against it. I'm a libertarian. I'm not religious. People can do whatever they want. But there was just something about it that made you uncomfortable. Like you were being asked to partake in it against your will.
Well, it also, I'll tell you what I didn't like about it is because I'm like, you do you. And, everyone, you be pan, we should all have whatever sex we want with whoever we want, as long as it's consensual and fun. But it was just so heterosexual. Like any time the conversation would drift towards polyamory, also involving homosexuality, or God forbid, men touching each other, like the law of God comes down and all of a sudden Jubal's there, giving you some lecture about like biology and Darwin and about how amazing. Oh, Mike has that moment when he's like, oh, humans must be better than Martians because they link reproduction with sex. And that's amazing. And it's like, but we don't really actually link reproduction and sex all the time. So I don't know. I found that argument. I think we spend a lot of time insisting on heterosexuality in this book. And I'm frankly fascinated why we spend so much time on that in 1961.
Well, I think Heinlein is clearly not comfortable with other arrangements.
One suspects he might not have been comfortable with some urges within himself.
Sex is between a wealthy, beloved author and his young secretaries, the way God intended. Okay,
right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
His young female secretaries. Be very careful what you say here. Because remember, there's a moment when Mike is willing to start making out with one of the other guys, maybe even Jubal, and everyone's like, "No, Mike, you can't do that." So,
right. Well, yeah, that goes without saying, Lisa. My gosh.
Well, no, it did go with saying apparently within the novel several times. That's my point. Interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So I mean, I totally agree with all of that in terms of just the way the book handles sex and gender from contemporary reader is super uncomfortable. But it's sort of fascinating to me that this book was it sold millions of copies. It was this defining book of a generation. I mean, it sounds like, I would imagine there were lots of women who read it and loved it and were recommending other women read it and stuff. And just the idea of a culture where that would happen seems so distanced from anything I can really have any firsthand understanding of. Go ahead, John.
I was just gonna say it really was, but it wasn't. I can't say that it was the book of a generation, but it was taken up by many people in my generation. And as you mentioned, David Crosby, who was in the Byrds and Crosby, Stills and Nash, he wrote a song called Triad, where it talks about three people being in a relationship and becoming water brothers. So, I mean, it got into, pop music. And of course, now there's controversy about this, but there's speculation and some small evidence that Charles Manson and his family were fans of this book. And it would be very strange if no one in Charles Manson's family had read this book. Okay, and that Manson found Mike a role model for certain things. Okay, for free sex and also for justifying the discorporation of people who are in whom one grok's wrongness. And so that to me, in fact, when I came back to this book when I was in college, that was the thing that just made me throw the book across the room. I just couldn't. I felt like the book really kind of sets itself up with the metaphysics of it, and not only that the facts of the universe are so set up that if you were to kill somebody, it's really not such a big deal because we're shown on the page that people are have an afterlife and they're reincarnated, and so if you kill someone, it's just sort of like being sent back to the end of the line, and you'll get your chance to come back again. And so it's not really such a morally fraught issue if you need to discorporate someone. And using the word discorporation rather than murder helps a lot, I think.
Well, let me just explain. Yeah, so Mike has all these powers. I would say that he is overpowered to a ridiculous extent that obviates a lot of what would be conflict in the novel. Wait, I made a little list of all his powers. Okay, so here's Mike's powers. He can make objects vanish into thin air. He has telekinesis, telepathy, astral projection. He can see in the dark. He's unaffected by heat or cold. He can change his appearance at will. He can win at gambling. He has perfect memory and can read books just by flipping the pages. He's also the best kisser ever. So basically, it's like he has the powers of like 7 X-Men all put together. It was actually just making this list. It was reminding me of like they say like Kim Jong-un, like the first time he played golf, he got a hole in one on every hole and stuff like that. It was like that kind of just sort of like ridiculous level of, of power and perfection and everything.
And he's also the wealthiest person there
right.
is, which also, in terms of the like economy of their little commune later on, and like, oh, we discovered this remarkable way to live where everyone gets, everybody's happy and this is the best way for everyone. I was like, well, okay, if you're a group of people with unlimited financial resources, of course this is going to work pretty well.
Right.
It's not, it doesn't end up saying anything very profound about how we should organize society in a world where people have different levels of access to things.
Yeah. So there's just,
Go ahead.
Yeah, so there's just occasional, like glimmers of conflict, but then, either Mike's massive fortune or Mike's supernatural powers just instantly quell any conflict that sort of pokes its head up. So, I mean, I just think that, I guess that's one thing I want to talk about is like, I don't think that this works very well as a dramatic story. And do people agree with that? And do they think that Heinlein intended it to work as a dramatic story? Did he care so much about other things that, it didn't matter? And do the people who like this book care about whether there's conflict or anything like that? So, so John, go ahead.
Well, I've actually reading this book again was interesting to me to sort of try to step back from my emotional reactions of the time. I mean, authors write their novels, at least sometimes and in parts, to express their opinions. So I guess it shouldn't surprise us that this book, expresses a lot of Heinlein's opinions. And not only that, when they construct the novel, it shouldn't surprise us that the books validate their beliefs in the way that the world works. And so in that sense, I think, Heinlein gives you a very, if you're willing to not think too much about it, a very fulfilling fantasy about the way things could be. Certainly if you had all these superpowers, that would be helpful. And if you knew you absolutely had a place in the afterlife and and having, this family, of, polyamorous people who are, completely, available to one another. No one ever seems to deny consent at any point here. Everyone, one of the slogans of Mike is "Thou art God," so that there is no God in the universe except for individual beings, and none of us are more God than anyone else. Although sometimes it seems to me the book. Anyway, so what I'm saying about this is that the book is presenting a kind of fantasy. I mean, it's presented as a science fiction book. If you think about all the things that you mentioned, David Lee, that Mike can do, and then this business of the afterlife and the Martians controlling the dead Martians, controlling the living Martians, it really is a fantasy novel. It's not a science fiction novel, and the fantasy supports the ethos that Heinlein is trying to put forth.
Well, I mean, the book has to me a lot of the character of a private joke, and Heinlein, started writing this in 1948, and it wasn't published until 1961. So he was working on it for 13 years. He says just waiting for the, climate to change enough that a publisher would be willing to publish it. So I wonder, as he was working on it, how much he was wondering if it would ever be published, and how much he was just kind of writing it for his own amusement and not aiming it at an audience the way he might have some other books that were written for more, with more of a commercial future in mind.
My understanding is that he was explicitly, by the time he came back to it in the late 50s and early 60s, writing it to get out of the juvenile market. So I thought there was some real intent behind, at least as it was being rewritten there at the end, and that there was an eye to publication, which maybe makes sense why it's more a fantasy novel at some level than a science fiction novel. That way he gets to get all his sort of edgy points in there and then not have to overworry the consequences. I actually hated the framework with the angels. I thought that was the cop-out. I liked the dead Martians controlling everything, but I don't know, the dead humans, that part was not my fave. But
yeah, it seems super weird to me. It's only like there's like a couple chapters in the afterlife. I think there's only like 3, if I remember correctly. So it's all kind of setting up Mike's. So like spoiler warning, but at the end, Mike sort of dies in a very sort of Jesus-like kind of way, and then in the last chapter we see him in the afterlife. So I think all the afterlife sections earlier in the book were just kind of setting that up, because I think that's how Heinlein wanted to end
the afterlife sections are. I agree very much with Lisa. Are like as hokey as possible. It's very like It's a Wonderful Life. Now you're a junior varsity angel until you do 17 good deeds, and then you'll be promoted. It's like it feels totally from a different book, almost, not to criticize, knock the guy, but almost deliberately lazy or something, or like not fully realized, and not even partly realized. Like it would have taken 30 seconds to write it because it's so underbaked compared to anything else. It feels out of like a children's story.
Agreed. And it feels like it's a whole different novel, right? Like, because if the shift is, well, it turns out like the afterlife and the spiritual life is real, and there's a human god versus these Martian gods, and they're kind of debating territory and getting things organized at some cosmic scale. Like, it's a cool cosmology, but I have a lot of questions. A lot of questions.
Well, because I mean, the ending. Like there were some interesting ideas that kind of came up toward the end, including so there's this idea that the Martians destroyed, that there used to be a planet, there used to be a 5th planet that was destroyed, and that's the asteroid belt, and it was destroyed by the Martians, who are supposedly these sort of wise, all-knowing beings. We're told for aesthetic reasons they destroyed this inhabited planet. And that they're considering also destroying Earth because they think that human beings are just kind of
wrong,
degraded, somehow, and
they
that
rock
it just
our wrongness.
that it just might be the artful aesthetic thing to wipe us out as well. So there were kind of interesting things like that come in toward the end, but are really underdeveloped and don't really go anywhere.
There's something. It almost suggests a little bit reminded me of the 3-body problem. Where but the idea is that Earth will be more advanced by the time, like they're more advanced now, right. But by the time they are going to actually get around to destroying us, we will have sufficiently developed ourselves so that we will be a formidable challenge, which is very similar to the 3-body problem, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, but there's... Oh, go ahead, John.
I would just very much doubt that Heinlein would ever seriously consider a situation where human beings could be exterminated by the Martians. He's a believer in, we're the toughest animals in the universe, and you'd cross us at your peril. It's in book after book. And so Martians may be deluded to think that they could destroy the human race, but it ain't going to happen.
Well, isn't that made clear at the end in one of the supernatural chapters when they're like, well, thank heavens, now that Mike has gone to Earth and sacrificed himself, and now he's come back and taken back his rightful place in the human heavens. They're like, phew, now the humans can evolve and they'll beat the Martians, right? So it is about human exceptionalism at the end.
It just seemed odd to me that theme wasn't, or that idea of the Martian threat wasn't developed more, given how many pages are given over to just mindless chit. It was like mindless chit chat. It was just like being at kind of like a boring party is how it felt in the second half. I mean, I'll say, I mean, like when I got in the second half of this, I don't remember ever having felt so unmotivated to finish a book. I can't even remember the last time. I really had to force myself because it's just like these super long sections of just these characters who are all totally interchangeable, just having sort of like, conversation, like kind of meaningless conversation. It was like for me being at a party, like you're sort of stuck at this party and everyone else is having a good time, but you're bored and you want to leave, but you can't. I mean, that's kind of how it felt to me reading the second half of this book.
Oh, it wasn't even like a party. It was like being in a college dorm, like a freshman college dorm at 2 a.m. That's what it was like.
The thing that sort of set me off about this is that they all are so completely interchangeable. The women, Jubal's secretaries, become completely interchangeable. They never were very distinct from one another. And in fact, all of the characters there's no breath of a feeling that anyone disagrees with anyone else or has a different opinion about how things ought to be done. They're all of one mind, and it's very, very boring, and it's kind of creepy. It strikes me that if you become a part of Mike's religion, you think alike, and you're all superior. And actually, there's that interesting conversation that Mike has with Jubal just before he undergoes his apotheosis at the end, where Mike's saying, I really messed up. I thought that we could start this church and human beings would all sign on, and then it would lead to utopia for humans. But lots of people are, and the quote is there, lots of people are indolent morons. And there's a quote here. In a matter of some generations, the stupid ones will die out, and those with your discipline will inherit the earth. That's Jubal saying that. So basically, he's telling Mike, look, your idea that you could raise everyone up to the level of understanding that you have is a delusion because most people are too stupid. And so the only thing that you can do is wait around for all those people to die out. And then the ones who are superior will inherit theirs. It's basically social Darwinism, not in obvious terms, but I think that's what's going on here. I think Heinlein basically is a libertarian who also is a social Darwinist, and so he feels that there are people who are better than others, and that it will sort itself out. And if it doesn't sort itself out naturally, then you might have to do some discorporations.
But it mostly will sort itself out naturally. And that's linked to all the sexual revolution stuff, right? Because it's like all the right-minded people are going to have this consciousness raising and get on board. Mm-hmm. And then they're the ones who are going to have all the sex and then in theory have all the babies. Although I love how anytime anyone has a baby in this book, they cannot get rid of it quick enough. For a book that keeps insisting on how important heterosexual reproduction is, it's astounding how everyone hates their children. It is like, they're all like, oh, the baby is horrible. Give it to someone else to deal with. Like they literally say that. Very odd. Written by a man who never had a child, by the way.
I guess I'm curious, Robby, you said that you, the politics of Moon a Harsh Mistress resonated with you more than the politics in this book. Was there anything in this book that kind of struck a chord with you, or that you could see why it struck a chord with people at the time?
And I say that because, Moon is a Harsh Mistress is really well liked by a lot of libertarians, more, in terms of its kind of depiction of the American Revolution in space is very, I'd put in the right, the bottom right quadrant. If you look at like the political compass map, the 4-quadrant thing, it's like in the right bottom, the right libertarian, because it's very much about property rights and voluntary associations. And like, that's how you have to make your life work on the moon because it's such a foreboding environment. This is, I would maybe put in like the left libertarian quadrant because, a lot of what the co-panelists are saying is very correct in the social Darwinism and the best, most advanced people are going to like deserve to have all of the great sex and run the commune, of course, but also that it's faux egalitarian in some way, or it's purporting to be egalitarian, and it's presupposing that, again, access to an unlimited supply of financial resources, so you never really have to want for anything. So it seems a little bit different. So very different in that way from the politics of, for instance, a Moon is a Harsh Mistress. I mean, he comes across obviously as very, Heinlein does vis-a-vis Jubal Harshaw and the entire perspective of the book, very hostile toward like the world government organizations. I think what's his name, Douglas is well, I guess he's not portrayed as like a complete moron. But very self-certain. He's not a noble figure. Like he is forced to do the right thing because he's outsmarted by Harshaw. The book seems to take a low opinion of the governing authorities and certainly of the religious authorities as well, because the Church of Foster is kind of our villains for the second half of the book, although Mike is not so much against them as like one-upping them or perfecting them. I mean, they explain that right over and over and over and over again in great detail that, well, they've mostly got it. I just have to be in charge of it, and we're all going to have sex with each other, and it'll be great. So yeah. Yeah,
well, I agree that the antagonists in the book, Douglas and Digby, Foster, I guess a little bit, are just sort of inadequate. They don't provide really any, countervailing force to the sheer awesomeness of Jubal and Mike. I was reading something online where they said that that this book was incredibly influential in promoting polyamory. There wasn't like an actual church, that takes its name from Mike's church in this book that was started. And this person, this was just some random internet comment, so I don't know how reliable this is, but they said that some significant percentage of people in the United States who practice polyamory today were influenced by this book or by, people who are influenced by this book at, 2 or 3 removes.
Go ahead.
I
have a Heinlein polyamory story.
Okay,
Can I tell it?
Yeah.
So when my husband and I were looking for our house in Atlanta, this was like 20 years ago, our agent was taking us around and he asked what we did. And we said, we're both professors of science fiction studies. And he got very excited about this. And he said, well, I want to show you the Heinlein house. And we're like, ooh, tell us about this. So he took us to this big warehouse, and supposedly the original owners of the warehouse had been influenced by Stranger in a Strange Land and built it for a communal polyamory family, right? So we went into the warehouse, and first of all, it was massive. It was like 2,000 square feet, and it had a gigantic 20-foot sunken hot tub in the middle of it. So, and all the walls were like 70s groovy line paintings of naked people frolicking around. It was the most amazing thing I've ever seen. And to this day, I really regret I didn't take photographs of it because it's long gone now. We didn't rent it because it didn't have a working kitchen and we didn't know what to do with the 20-foot underground hot tub. But it was cool. And I think that it's pretty weird that like in early 2000s, Atlanta, Georgia, people were like, oh, the Heinlein polyamory house, So I guess there was some impact somewhere.
Yeah.
I have an anecdote also about Heinlein, which sort of ties into the idea that there were many, many people who, saw him as a wise person and a role model, and the sexual revolution, which really hit in the 70s. I mean, 60s and 70s, but by the mid 70s, it sort of had lost its political aspect, and it was just then a lot of people having sex. At any rate, at the World Science Fiction Convention was in Kansas City in 1976, and that's where I lived at that time. And I was a huge Heinlein fan still, though I had my doubts. And so he was the guest of honor, and he gave a guest of honor speech. And he came into this auditorium, which was just loaded with fans and readers, and got a real huge ovation. And he got up to the lectern, and he took out a kitchen timer, and he turned it to like 55 minutes or something and put it on the edge of the lectern. He said, I'm going to talk for 55 minutes. And then he began talking. And by the end of the 55 minutes, he had turned so many people in that audience against him that they were booing him. And so, I didn't even remember all the things that set them off. And I don't know that it was completely fair, actually, but because I think anyway, I remember one thing he said, however, was that he thought that in the next 10 years, there would be a nuclear war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and that this would be a good thing because it would clear out a lot of the dead wood of the human race because of the harsh, ability to survive. And then that would be better in the long run for human beings because we were getting inundated by people who were useless and a dead weight on society. So I don't know quite what to make of that. I think he didn't really socialize that much in the last 15 years of his life. I don't believe. Maybe he had close friends, but he was not so much out in the world or in the public eye very much.
Well, I guess one thing I was curious about his impact on science fiction culture. I've just heard, this is long before my time, but that for a while, I think in the 70s, it was sort of a tradition at science fiction conventions for people to get naked and all jump in the hotel pool and go skinny dipping. And nudism is another sort of thing that gets promoted pretty heavily in this novel. And I was just wondering if there was any connection between those two facts, or was that just kind of the 70s, how things were?
Well, I think the science fiction world, at least the fan world that I grew up in, I'm not as familiar with it now, has actually been very open to alternative ways of living. And, not always very well regulated, but that's sort of the point, isn't it? That science fiction fans will accept. I know I saw people accepted in science fiction conventions that out in the regular world would be looked at sideways. And I think that's to the benefit of that science fiction subculture. But, I think that Heinlein spoke to a lot of people in that world. At least when I was growing up as a science fiction fan, most science fiction people were misfits of one sort or another. If you couldn't be on the football team, or if you couldn't be a cheerleader, or you couldn't, be in some social club, you could be a science fiction fan, and people would not judge you as for your appearance, say, or the way you spoke, or any number of other things, in a way that was very empowering and maybe addictive too, for people who found the world of science fiction fans. And I think Heinlein spoke to a lot of these people.
Yeah, I guess I'll also just say, you mentioned the Charles Manson thing. I don't know a lot about that, but I did read an article in research for this that apparently Charles Manson, one of his children was named Valentine Michael Manson. So there was obviously some influence there. But this article was saying that Charles Manson had been in prison, and it just kind of like people were talking about Stranger in a Strange Land, and that Charles Manson had just sort of picked up some of the lingo or whatever, that he had never actually read the book, that he wasn't really a big reader. And so he was just sort of like would pluck, influences from whatever was popular or whatever he thought would resonate with people, whether it was the Beatles or, like Stranger in a Strange Land or whatever. So yeah, I don't think there was a soup. Oh, go ahead.
I'm going to say I wouldn't dispute that. He was really very good at manipulating people, and might have used whatever came to hand to manipulate them.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Does anyone else have anything that they have just been wanting to, any big topics or anything they want to bring up?
One other thing I was going to maybe mention or bring up is, so I really like the Ben Caxton character. He's a journalist. I'm a journalist. I'm always interested by how journalists are, writer, reporter, people are portrayed in fiction. Often they're portrayed in a way that just does not resemble the real job at all. Like, oh, I've spent the last 10 weeks working on a story. People got to write. People got to produce every day in order to make it work. But and he's a columnist. He's a column writer who's important enough that the Secretary General guy of the United Nations equivalent group hates him and reads his columns. That's kind of so he's a big and important journalist. And it just so happens that he knows Jillian already. So there's a incredible coincidence that begins this book, which is that Ben Caxton, who's this must be one of the four most important columnists on Earth, which is itself kind of hard to believe, and is good friends with this most famous author, philosopher, doctor guy on Earth. They're really good friends, and then he just happens to be casually dating, or she's one of a number of girls he's dating, but they're pretty well connected to have dinner anyway. Who just happens to be the nurse working in the room next to where the guy from Mars gets put, is an extraordinary plot kind of situation to kick off the book that I couldn't help but roll my eyes at a little bit.
Well, yeah. That was something that really bugged me early on. Was that not only all of that, you're absolutely 100% right about that, but then also the room where the Martian guy is being held under Marine guard just happens to have another door into it that they somehow didn't notice. So she's able to go in and talk to him. And then when she comes back the second time, the door is being guarded by a doctor who just happens to have an upset stomach and needs to run to the bathroom and needs someone to watch the door for him. It's just just contrivance piled on contrivance. And so the plotting is in a lot of ways really lazy. Somebody used that word earlier. And again, I don't know quite what to make of it, because Heinlein was, a really good writer in other books that I've read. It's still I keep having to check this to make sure that it's correct, but I just could not believe that this was written before The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. I was sure that The Moon is a Harsh Mistress must have been toward the end of his normal books, and then this was toward the start of his weird books. But it's actually, he wrote this and then The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, and that just totally baffles me.
I had the exact same feeling, because The Moon is a Harsh Mistress is so workmanlike, almost like instruction manual-like. I mean, it has philosophy in it too, but here is the very believably plotted way you would here's step 1 of the revolution, here's step 2, many pages later, here's step 769, here's step 770. Whereas this relies on a lot of coincidences, and don't get me wrong, there are still interesting things that are happening. The idea of them having the fake interview with the fake Mike early on is very interesting. Ben all of a sudden realizing, oh shoot, I got in a random taxi and they're watching me and I'm going to get disappeared now, was really interesting. Mike using his, I think I described as the point where the book really did hook me. I'm like, well, how are they going to get out of this? Oh wait, he can just make people disintegrate. Was cool and effective. So I don't, maybe we're knocking the book a lot. I really did enjoy the first half, and I was very hooked by it. And I thought it had a lot of interesting things happening and was building towards something even more interesting. And I really enjoyed watching and listening to Mike's interaction with people and how his language operated. And I thought it was a very original, a lot of originality behind the conception of this character that unfortunately goes very much awry.
Well, there was one line that sticks in my head where it says of Ben Caxton in his role as a journalist, it says something like, he had discovered that he could make headway by going to the top and making himself as much of a pain as possible. And that struck me as sort of like telling, and made me wonder if, I don't know if Heinlein had ever worked as a journalist or anything, but there were certain aspects of the portrayal of the Ben Caxton character that did ring true to me, and that I did, I did appreciate.
Heinlein did have some practical political experience in the mid-30s. After he got out of the Navy, he got involved in the governorship campaign of Upton Sinclair. I think it was in 1936. who lost, and it was on a social credit platform. It was sort of a weird kind of socialist platform. And Heinlein's very interesting, actually. I mean, because I think he's always a libertarian, but he's also, at the start anyway, was very much amenable to, social welfare plans. And then he gradually moved away from that, although, there are different arguments made about that. Actually, I think he ran once for California state legislature and lost. So
he did.
So he knew something of the political world. And I want to say that I've been pretty negative here, but I taught science fiction for many, many years at North Carolina State University, and I always have a Heinlein book in my syllabus because he is one of the most influential science fictioners, maybe the most of at least the first half or the first 3/4 of the 20th century. Even writers who have no knowledge and never read Heinlein, things that he did first are reflected in the work that they do. And he was a extremely skilled, powerful, witty, a really good storyteller. Through the first 25 years of his career, it seems to me, it was only till the mid 60s when he, I think, started to go at least off a path where I could follow him.
But again, this was his most popular book. I mean, it sold like 5 million copies or something. So, whatever issues we have with it, I mean, it worked. Or, I mean, like people liked it like more than his other books that we like better. I don't really understand it, but I mean,
I think people liked it because it's not exactly a science fiction novel. We've spent a lot of time here identifying how it's really much more of a fantasy novel, right? And it doesn't sort of demand a lot of hard intellectual engagement because all of the rules of play are set up for you, right? So it's just these very contained little thought experiments. Honestly, I think that's why it's popular. It's easy.
Well, I think also, it deals with sex and religion, which people care about more than they care about
cannibalism,
space exploration. Unfortunately,
yeah, and cannibalism.
More's the pity.
Let's not forget that.
When I read, I read that that the original idea for this that Heinlein got was from someone suggesting it be like the Jungle Book, but someone coming from Mars instead of, an infant being abandoned to live in the jungle. And I've always been a huge fan of the Jungle Book. It was my favorite Disney movie growing up. And that ends, of course, with Mowgli deciding that, they're trying to return Mowgli to the human civilization, but he's been raised by animals, so he loves being among animals, and he doesn't view himself as a human at all until the last scene of the movie. He sees for the first time, what does he see? A human female, very drawn in a very curvy way, walking back to her village. And then it's goodbye, animals, no more. I'm following her back to the village, which seems oddly fitting given all the focus Mike's, not distracting him because it just becomes part of his philosophy, but his easy access to the female form in the second half of the book.
That's actually a great point, right? Because that's the thing that makes Mike start thinking about himself as human rather than Martian, right?
Yes.
Is when he starts to be like, oh my God, humans, they don't separate sex and reproduction, and this makes them evolutionarily superior even to the Martians, and I'm going to throw my lot in with them. So yeah, I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, he levels up, right? It went after he has sex with Jillian for the first time. That's when he starts talking more normally.
Yes. Whereas when everyone has sex with him, they start talking more like Mike.
Yes.
In the long version that I read, there's this preface by Virginia Heinlein, and she tells the story of the origin of the book in a little bit more detail, and it's kind of interesting because I think it was Astounding magazine back in the 50s. Some fan wrote a letter saying, it was like a joke, but it's like, oh, I got an issue of Astounding from a year in the future, and here's what the table of contents were. And then they decided, John W. Campbell decided, let's actually do it. And he would commission all those authors to write the stories from this fictional table of contents. And so Heinlein and his wife Virginia were trying to come up with a title or a story that fit this title. I forget what the title was. I think it was one word, and that's when she suggests golf, right?
Golf.
And that's when she suggested this Jungle Book on Mars thing, and that's how the whole thing kind of got rolling.
I don't want to question Virginia Heinlein, but Golf was not related to this book. Golf is the prequel to Friday, which he wrote much, much later. It sets up the characters who are in Friday, unless I'm mistaken.
She says that they considered that idea, but then discarded it because it was too big for a short story. But that was the origin, and then he wrote something else.
Gotcha. All right.
I guess speaking of animals, one of the later scenes in the book that probably my favorite scene from later in the book is where they go to the zoo and Mike sees these monkeys mistreating each other, and he starts to laugh, and he laughs for the first time because he now understands what it means to be human and why people laugh, and that scene kind of resonated with me. That was one of the ones that I marked as a favorite.
Isn't the snake being used to keep the baby at one point? Did I misunderstand that? Right, the snake is a more fit parent than any of the people around the commune.
Yep. Now, I actually kind of like that. Like, there's this sort of moment of neat, I think very modern, contemporary environmental thinking there about our relationship to nature, but so much, it's not, the time is not right, and it can't quite be sustained, right? But there are these moments. That's actually some of the stuff I really like. I like when Mike is grokking the grass.
Yeah. And
that grass wants to be walked on and stuff. I like those moments of connection. We don't get enough of those. Too much human brotherhood, not enough bigger eco brotherhood.
I guess one thing that really sort of surprised me about this book was I was expecting there to be tons of drugs. And I don't really remember any drugs at all, unless I'm forgetting something. And there's one passing reference to marijuana, which is faintly disapproving. So
they drink a lot of booze, though.
Well, it's just 61 when the book came out, right? So we're not exactly at the peak of drug culture yet.
Were you going to say something, John?
Oh, it's just, the book really was in anticipation ahead of the counterculture by 5 years or more. People think that the 60s started in 1961, but they didn't really start till 1965 or 66.
Yeah, well, last panel we discussed Rendezvous with Rama, which is a novel that was written in the 70s and reads like it was written in the 50s. And this is kind of the opposite of that. This is a novel that was written in the 50s and reads like it was written in the 70s. And so, I do think you have to give Heinlein credit for being 20 years ahead of his time, or, capturing, it's an impressive thing to capture this. So specifically the zeitgeist of a future decade. I think the problem is just then reading it 50 years on. Go ahead.
I think the gender stuff is of its moment, David.
Well, that's true. But I do think anyone reading this today would assume it was written in the 70s, not that he started writing it in 1948. It just seems like a very 70s book to me.
Now, Heinlein's treatment of female characters is also very interesting because in the context of the 1940s pulp writers, he was very ahead of his time and allowing the women to be, instead of just citing the monster and screaming and fainting, they were extremely competent and intelligent and resourceful. A story like Delilah and the Space Riggers from the late 40s is all about a woman going into a male workplace in outer space and the men rejecting her until they discover that she actually can hold her own and be better than many of them at her job. So that was unusual at the time.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, the sort of the affect of something like Stranger really seems to not really engage with the female characters. Is that what you feel?
I do enjoy Jillian as a character. Sometimes she's just being used as a sounding board, I guess, for other people. Although Jubal Hershaw does a lot of that to almost everyone else. But she's shown to be very capable in helping get Mike out of the situation, and very loyal to him. And I find their relationship very engaging. It's a shame that it then kind of gets just generalized to everyone Mike is in a relationship with, and she loses kind of some of her distinction. But I find her at least passably compellingly individually written. Maybe you have a different idea about her, Lisa. I don't know.
No, I agree. And I think what was interesting to me is I find her fascinating and really relatable and cool for the first third of the book. And then after that, I want to throw her out. And John, when you had mentioned that he probably drafted a lot of this in the 40s, that first part, I just thought that clicked for why I liked Jillian so much at first almost, and then not later. It's like, if you think about her as a character, especially for the 40s or 50s, 100% very cool, very capable. And in fact, in a world of men, it's only the woman who's a nurse who knows how to act right. And that's exciting. But then we get to the rest of it, and then it goes a little south, I think. She becomes less compelling, like you said, Robby, like less distinct. And it's weird. It seems like that happens when he returns to her, I guess, almost in the late 50s or early 60s, and coming at her through this playboy philosophy lens that I feel like diminishes the character.
Well, it's not written to be believable that she would decide that what I really want to do is be a showgirl, even if she's a very beautiful woman. There's nothing wrong none of us are stigmatizing that career choice or anything, but it doesn't seem like that's something the character would do to me.
Well, never forget that Heinlein put himself through the military academy by tap dancing at roadhouses. So I don't know. I've always figured that's where his weird interest in showmanship came from.
Farrah Mendelssohn, in her book on Heinlein, makes a big point about how all the sex in Stranger is the women consent to it. There's no unconsenting sex, and that consent is a big deal, not just in regards to the sexual relationships, but in all of the relationships between the people, that they have to consent, okay, for anything to be done. That there's very much a kind of libertarian vision that everyone's autonomous, and an autonomous agent, making a deal, and so that she argues that he respects women in that regard. But it's hard for me, as you said, Lisa, to not feel that Jillian is flattened and becomes just like all the other women after the second into the second half of the book.
Yeah, and let me just be clear, if there's any ambiguity about this, I don't think that the book handles sex and gender in a way that's sort of gonna resonate with a contemporary audience. And I think, unfortunately, it makes the book pretty hard to recommend to a contemporary audience. And I think the book is sort of, I see, destined to fade into obscurity because of that aspect of the story. So yeah, it's definitely an inescapable issue with this book, in my opinion.
Well, I find that when my students read it, and increasingly few of them do, although they all know of it and they're like, oh yeah, maybe I should read it. And then they read the plot and they're like, I'm good. But the ones who do, they don't even stress about the sex and gender stuff. They're like, oh yeah, that's a period piece, isn't it? And what interests them now is much more the critique of religion. Especially, I live in the U.S. South, and the children down here are becoming increasingly godless, and so they're very interested in that. And then, like I said, the little bits of almost environmental consciousness. But given that there's not a lot to hang your hat on, really, frankly, in either of those, I agree, Dave. I think it might be the beginning of the end for this book.
Yeah. And I'm very sympathetic to the, critiques of, sexual repressiveness and organized religion and everything. But I just think, there's just not enough, I think the ideas are good. There's just not enough of a story. You need both, I think, and the basic mechanics of plot and conflict and character growth and climax is just sort of not strong enough in this book to sustain so many hundreds of pages. But we are out of time, so we're going to need to start wrapping things up. So Robby, any other final thoughts? Anything else you wanted to mention?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've hit the nail on the head with this one. Yeah, just picking up on what it has to say about religion. It obviously doesn't, it's not like a book that it doesn't take a side against religion or even against a specific religion, because Mike is himself creating or improving or perfecting a religion. There is some interesting stuff when the close look at what is actually going on with the foster rights that has, again, this kind of gambling or excesses or vice that are permitted if they are involving products that are sanctioned by the church, which we're led to believe that they have a financial relationship with the church, kind of like a very modern indulgence system. That was making me think of major corporate governance from things like Snow Crash or things of that nature. Had me reminded of that, like a kind of sci-fi dystopia where everything's run by different corporations or something like that. The blending of that with the religious foster right was interesting. But again, when we only get a glimpse of that, and then that too fades from the picture. But there was certainly a kernel of a very interesting idea there, or something that felt like it was going to be fleshed out much more, or like we were going to be revealed that there's corruption there, or there's something going on behind the scenes. But then it's just used to say that it was part of a sort of passable idea that they had that's going to be perfected in the vision of Valentine Michael Smith, excuse me.
Yeah, I also thought it was kind of interesting where Mike says he's not trying to create a religion. He's trying to spread a philosophy, but people don't want philosophy. So you kind of have to package it as a religion. That's what
That sounded as convincing as like Paul Atreides' denials that he's starting a galactic jihad, right?
Right.
Yeah, but I thought that was an interesting thread that, again, sort of didn't get developed as much as I would have liked. But Lisa, final thoughts on this book?
Yeah, definitely a window into a period of literary and cultural history that in some ways is the beginning of our own contemporary moment, but in some ways is very, very different. And so I think it's interesting to read for that reason, to see both where the ideas he's playing with are ones that we continue to grapple with and where they're not so much. But having said that, I think that unless you are really excited about a look into that period of time, or really want to have read all your Heinlein, that there might be other more interesting and provocative Heinlein stories to look at.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely my take on it at this point, is that I would not really recommend it as a entertaining read, but it is definitely important for historical interest, but I would only really approach it or recommend it on that basis. But John, final thoughts?
I guess I would say that I'm an old dude, and I read this stuff, when it was pretty new. I would not recommend the book to contemporary readers that much, but I think Heinlein is a worthwhile writer to read. And to me, the most interesting things he wrote were all the things he wrote between, say, 1940 and 1960. And also his short fiction. It seems to me in his short fiction,
yes,
he's really confined to a shorter space, so he's not allowed to bloviate at all in his short stories. So his stories really are very. They remind me of sort of Dashiell Hammett stories or James M. Cain stories, in the sense that they're really skillful, popular fiction, pulp fiction, I guess you could call it. And the best of them are very good. And the best of them are very weird too. I still think that All You Zombies is it's a remarkable story. It was written in 1959, just before this. And in some ways, actually, I don't think he wrote any short stories after it. It was like he wrote his best story and then he quit writing short stories and went into these massive novels where he could sort of go on about things. So I guess I'm just saying I would recommend you look for some of Heinlein's earlier fiction, in particular his short fiction.
Yeah, and again, I mean, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, which we discussed last time, I would recommend that. I thought that was quite good. And I mean, like I said, I have very fond memories of books like Tunnel in the Sky and Time for the Stars. It makes me curious to go back and read them now to see what I would think now, but I certainly remember loving them. So I still have a huge amount of fondness for Heinlein, but this book was not one of my favorites. So, but maybe for a future panel we'll do Starship Troopers or one of those other ones. I'd be really curious to see how they hold up for me now. But we are again all out of time, so I think we're going to need to wrap things up there. So again, we've been speaking with Lisa Yaszek, John Kessel, and Robby Soave. So thanks everyone so much for joining us.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to Lisa Yaszek, John Kessel, and Robby Soave for joining us on the show. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoyed the show and want it to continue, please support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/geeks or via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.